Hey everybody, welcome back to A Matter of Life and Maiden, the podcast of the Beast. I am Joe Labriola. And on today's episode, if you couldn't tell by the artwork, we're going to be talking about Eddie, Iron Maiden's mascot. Who is the best Eddie? What is the best version of Eddie? As everybody knows, I'm sure Eddie has been the perennial staple in Iron Maiden's cover art for their albums, their discography, their merchandising, their t-shirts, their tour posters, all the way down to the stage set, Nico's drums, everything has something to do with Eddie the Head. And the great thing about Eddie is there's so many variations. So for the purpose of time saving, we're just going to focus on the albums and then some of the peripheral and supplemental materials that go with the actual studio albums, like live records and stuff like that. We'll kind of wrap that in with the album that it kind of came out around with. Like, for example, just off the top of the head here, Powerslave Eddie, right? There's Pharaoh Eddie, there's Mummy Eddie, and then there's Live After Death. Kind of like wrap Live After Death in with that, if that makes sense, because to do any other way would be a very, very long podcast. I mean, we're talking about, we could go on for hours, for days, talking about all these different Eddies. But to kick it off, I've always loved Eddie. He's amazing. The greatest mascot, the greatest character in heavy metal and probably rock history in terms of like sleeve designs and mascots for bands. You know, other bands have emulated that. Prime example, Megadeth with Vic Rattlehead. I mean, he's pretty much Eddie, right? No one has done it like Iron Maiden has done it with Eddie, and he is the greatest. So, we're going to go from my least favorite to my most favorite, and let's get this thing started. So, coming in at last place, there's 17 studio albums, so coming in at number 17, the worst Eddie ever. And I hate to do this because I really dig it. I really do. But the worst Eddie ever has to be, for me, Dance of Death Eddie. Just because of that cover. I mean, he's cool as the Grim Reaper. He's awesome. But the album cover is just weak. It's just so weak. There's nothing great about his caricature. He's just Eddie with a scythe and a black robe. He doesn't look interesting. He's not that great. Even like Rainmaker, the single cover, or Wildest Dreams, he's still kind of plain looking. There is nothing great about that Eddie. However, Death on the Road, like the Undertaker Eddie with the wagon pulled by like the Black Nightmare steeds, that is an amazing Eddie. That should have been the cover. Like, that should have been the Dance of Death cover, Death on the Road, that live record. And that's a killer record, an amazing record, and an amazing Eddie, to say the least. But even with that, the artwork is amazing for that, but Eddie himself is not as fleshed out as he will be on some of these later ones. So coming in at 17, hate to say it because I do dig the record a lot, Dance of Death Eddie. Or if you want to call it Grim Reaper Eddie. Coming in at number 16, No Prayer for the Dying Eddie. Now this Eddie is just both versions. The original version with him coming out of the grave and grabbing the grave digger, who was allegedly supposed to be modeled after Rod Smallwood, who later Rod Smallwood would have it removed, and he would ask Derek Riggs to resubmit it without the grave robber, right, or the grave digger. But both of those versions of Eddie just very plain. It didn't take into consideration anything that happened to Eddie in the previous years, the previous decade. It was almost like a soft reboot of the character and a soft reboot of the band, as we see with No Prayer for the Dying in 1990, which in a previous podcast I ranked that as the worst album they've ever done. He's bland. There's nothing cool about him. Like, even like the Hooks in You, or the Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter art, the Holy Smoke art. It's just Eddie with long hair and like a t-shirt and a jacket on. Leather jacket. There's nothing that great about him. It doesn't look that cool. And the cover itself is just him with like a ripped shirt, right? It's like Eddie with long hair and a ripped shirt. It's going back to the bare bones approach of like the original record, but the original record did it a million times better, as far as I'm concerned, right? So, yeah, nothing great about that Eddie. I don't think he's really that memorable. There's nothing cool about him. So, even some of the live show stuff with No Prayer, it's not that memorable. He's just not a good Eddie. He's not that great. So I have to say he's in that slot. Not as bad as Dance of Death Eddie. There's still a little bit more character there. So No Prayer for the Dying Eddie is in the 16th slot. Number 15. This one is going to go to X Factor Eddie. And the reason I say that is because he's just a very interesting design. They do the lobotomy thing again with his brain. They vivisect him on this vivisection machine on this table. But the claymation look, that puppet look that Hugh Syme did with Eddie, it's not the classic Iron Maiden look. It's not that really cool, awesome, almost cartoonish, comic booky look. And I'll say this, and I might go off a little on a tangent here, but Bruce Dickinson, when they were doing like the Final Frontier, the behind the scenes for that record that was released, if you bought the special edition, they had like a behind the scenes of making the Final Frontier. Bruce talks about like how they created Alien Eddie and how he wanted to give it like that artistic, timeless quality to it. He said he could have done something that looked like H.R. Geiger's Alien, right? Like an Alien Eddie that way, but it would have just taken away from it. Like the realism would have made it almost something different. Like it wouldn't have that timelessness to it. It wouldn't have that majestic quality. So that's kind of what happened with the X Factor Eddie, like the vivisected version of him. And even on like Man on the Edge, where it's just like a close-up of a side shot of him on the table, on the vivisection table, or Lord of the Flies, where he's wearing like a crown and a robe, but it's the same Eddie from the X Factor cover. It's just not. There's nothing memorable about it. It's a different take, and it's cool, but it's not. It's just not super cool. Like it's not Eddie. It's not Eddie as we know him. It's not that awesome artwork that Derek Race turned out in the '80s. Or some of this newer stuff that we'll get to. So for that, it's just not up to snuff. It gets a couple more points than Dance of Death and No Prayer because it was risky and they did go in a slightly different direction, so I give them props for creativity that way and experimentation. But as an Eddie as a whole, he's just not one of the strongest. Number 14. Coming in at number 14, now, I might get some crap for this one. But number 14 Eddie is actually a matter of life and death Eddie. Like, everybody knows, like, this is one of my favorite records, right? It's, like, up there for me. It's, like, it's in the top 3 Maiden records for me of all time, right? But it's just, the Eddie on that was a little bit of a letdown. I love the cover art. I think it's amazing with all the skeletons and the tank and the paint on the tank with the Eddie face and the cross guns and everything is really cool. The Matter of Life and Death cover art, don't get me wrong, is amazing. I love it. But Eddie himself as a caricature, as the mascot, he's kind of not in the forefront. He's in the background. So for that, it kind of loses a lot of points that way. I mean, even if you think about a Matter of Life and Death Eddie in your head, like what do you picture? You picture the tank and you picture the rest of the stuff, right? You picture the skeletons. You don't really think about Eddie. You think about that amazing piece of art, and it is amazing. But it's not Eddie as we know it. Like historically, throughout the years, Eddie took the forefront. He's in the background, which could have been some play on the band. Like, hey, look, this is a team effort. This is an amazing record. It's going to be about all of us with Eddie in the background now, and they played that record in its entirety. So I mean, maybe that has something to do with it. But in terms of we're ranking Eddies here, right? The best Eddie, that has to be at that place. And if you tie in Different World Eddie, it's kind of cool, almost in that same vein as Wildest Dreams and Rainmaker. Did be a cool version. But the reincarnation of Benjamin Breeg, that artwork is unbelievable for A Matter of Life and Death. That's a fantastic and phenomenal piece of art. One of the greatest artworks of Eddie ever. But sadly, that's not the cover, right? That's a supplement to the rest of these artworks. So I hate to put, one of my favorite albums, Eddie's, in this slot at number 14, but it has to be there for that reason. Just because it's not really Eddie. I mean, the forefront, he's just not there. He's not in the forefront. He's in the background, and I like my Eddies up close and personal, right? I want to see what he looks like. I want to see what he's doing. I want to see him doing weird stuff in different places. You don't really get a lot of that with A Matter of Life and Death. So for that, that's why it's where it's at. Number 13. Number 13 for me is going to be Virtual 11 Eddie. Now, I like the artwork for the album cover. I think it's really cool. The entire artwork is cool besides the soccer thing. Like the soccer thing on the left-hand side where there's a soccer game going on, I really don't dig that much. The rest of it, though, with him as like this kind of like virtual reality monster coming out of the machine or the game system, getting ready to take the kid, the broken fingernails, like the really long fingers, the big ears, the grin. Like, he's just menacing looking, and I dig it. I dig that artwork. I really dig that artwork. I don't dig the single covers because they did that kind of, like, puppet kind of claymation look again with the single covers for, like, Angel and the Gambler and Future Real. But if you look at, like, some of the Derek Riggs submitted art or whoever else was involved, Mark Wilkinson, Melvin Grant, whoever else was involved in the single covers, like the Angel and the Gambler art, like the actual like sketched art, is amazing. There's a couple different variations of it, but it's really cool. There's one with him sitting down playing cards. There's one with him on like a steamboat. It's a really cool artwork with like a top hat, and he has like a long cigar or a long cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Very cool art. And the one that Derek Riggs did for Future Real with like almost a Powerslave setting, like a power station with Eddie's head, super awesome. They should have used that. Like they should have used that for the single covers. Like it was amazing. So yeah, I mean it has that classic art feel. It has that really cool vibe. It's interesting. It's unique. The alternate single art covers are amazing for it. The original single art covers for it stink. Like they're not good at all. But the album cover itself, Virtual 11 Eddie, is back to that classic feel. I mean, it's not perfect, but it really does have that kind of classic, timeless feel. So for that, that's why it's in the number 13th slot. Number 12. Coming in at number 12, Brave New World Eddie. Now, I love Brave New World again. This record, it's so cool. It's an amazing record. It's one of my favorites. It's my top 10, right? But Eddie himself as a storm up in the sky is interesting and it's unique, but it's not one of the strongest Eddies. It's just his face. There is no body. We don't get to see what he's all about. Now, supplemental covers for this, like The Wicker Man, which I believe Mark Wilkinson did, amazing. I mean, that's an amazing Eddie as this big wicker monster with all these people wearing masks, like these people who worship the Wicker Man, this cult with like torches and stuff. It's a beautiful cover. Phenomenal cover. That is an amazing piece of art just in itself. And then if you look at like the Out of the Silent Planet extended cover where he's like a spokesperson, Eddie's a spokesperson with like the longer hair and he's talking, and there's Eddie's head like around the podium and it says Out of the Silent Planet, and there's like galaxies and outer space behind them. It's like they're in this like space station and he's giving like a press conference. Super cool. Those two pieces of art are amazing. Amazing supplements to that. Like they are unbelievable to look at, unbelievable. But Eddie himself as Brave New World Eddie, just a storm in the sky. It's just not that memorable. It's just not, he's not fleshed out. It's his face. It's his face in the sky, his face in the clouds. Cool ideology, again, points and creativity for the band for doing that. But Eddie as a whole, he's just not there. Same thing with Rock in Rio. Like, Rock in Rio, the concert to supplement this, like, the cover is just Eddie in the clouds. And, like, if you open it up or you look at the back of it, it's like Eddie is the stage. And when he opens his mouth, that's where the band plays. Like, interesting concept, cool, but not one of the strongest Eddies. Like, very interesting, but he's just not in that cream of the crop, top of the line Eddie category, right? We're still working on that. We're not quite there yet. We're not quite there yet for the Eddies. That's it for Brave New World Eddie. Coming in at number 11. I have to give this one to the original Iron Maiden Eddie at number 11. Great blueprint, and I'm talking about the original album, and then they remastered it and did a new artwork. They're both very similar, both the same kind of, You know, the original one looks more kind of cartoony. The remastered version looks more realistic looking, like it looks like he has skin, like actual flesh. But it's still the iteration of Eddie that is not the strongest. I mean, it's just Eddie standing there in front of like a brick wall with some lights, and it's not. There's nothing captivating that much about it. It's not Eddie in his prime. And I say this as a Maiden fan, you know, in hindsight, because I became a fan like in the early 2000s. I'm sure when this record came out in 1980, people were like, this is amazing, right? They were like, what is this thing on this cover? It's fantastic. And it is, and it does set the tone, and that's why it's in the number 11 slot. I mean, it really does set the tone for what Eddie's going to become. It's an amazing piece of art in itself, and the story behind it, and the foundation, and what it brought. But as a whole, it's just not that memorable. Even some of the single covers, like the Running Free cover, it's just Eddie's hand chasing people down an alley. They didn't want to show you what Eddie looked like, which is a cool reveal. But not that memorable to some of the other stuff, like the Sanctuary one with him and a knife and all. Like, it's just not as good or as polished or as refined as what some of these other ones are going to be. So for that, the original Iron Maiden Eddie is at number 11. Number 10, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son Eddie. Now, I love Seventh Son of a Seventh Son Eddie. I think he's awesome, but it's just weird. It's like him holding this like umbilical cord. There's flames coming out of his head. Really interesting art. Really cool. The supplemental stuff for it, like the Clairvoyant single cover, Can't Play with Madness single cover, the Evil That Men Do single cover, Eddie as like a prophet or a seer with the two candles and the crystal ball. Like, that's awesome. Like, that's top shelf stuff. But the actual cover, Eddie himself, as I guess they call this quote unquote post-Cyborg Eddie, he's just not that memorable to me. Like, he's not fully formed. He's not the Eddie I want him to be. It's weird and it's different and it's interesting and I love it. I dig it. I mean, like, it's on the top 10, right? But there's just something about that Eddie that just doesn't hit home as some of these other ones that we got coming down the line. It's the classic artwork and it looks amazing. The ice sculptures of Eddie, the full sleeve and everything, it's killer. The Infinite Dreams Eddie on the motorcycle is pretty cool, but again, it's just Eddie with on a motorcycle, right? Amazing looking. I mean, like artistically, it's brilliant, but still not one of the strongest Eddies. It's just not there yet. It's just not there. So that's number 10 for Seventh Son. Coming in at number 9, Killer's Eddie. Now, this version of Eddie is really kick-ass. It's awesome. This is like the original Iron Maiden times 10. This is where that foundational piece from Iron Maiden evolves and it becomes like, this is the canvas now for Eddie. And this version of Eddie is where they take him in all these different directions. And they start to evolve from this version in particular, with the longer hair, the smile on his face, the more deviousness to the character, the playfulness to him. That you get that with Killer's Eddie. And some of the single covers for Killers were actually really awesome. Like Twilight Zone was an amazing cover with him as like a spirit, or in the mirror, really cool. And Purgatory, that cover with the half devil face and the half Eddie face, that's a brilliant cover. It's an amazing version of the character, and it really ties into the Killer's Eddie with that little smirk, like I said, after he axes somebody on the cover. Huge improvement over the original Iron Maiden sleeve, and just that foundational piece for Iron Maiden. And then some of the supplements with that, like Made in Japan and all those things, Eddie with the samurai sword, really interesting. A really cool evolution of the original Eddie. And like I said, the blueprint. Still though, even in this 9th slot, he's not what the rest of these guys coming in. We got 8 more coming in are going to be about. So that's it for Killer's Eddie. Not too much to say about him. Very similar kind of what the original Iron Maiden cover was. You know, he's just in the city, but this time he's killed someone, right? Coming in at number 8, Number 8 is Fear of the Dark Eddie. One of the strongest and most iconic Eddies of all time. Like, if you listen to previous podcasts, you all know that I am not a huge fan of the Fear of the Dark record. I think it's one of the worst records they've ever done. I think it's, after No Prayer, I think it's the second worst, or the second weakest they've ever done. But I can't discount the kick-assness that is the Fear of the Dark Eddie. Like, that Eddie, that version of him, where he's ingrained in with the tree, like they're one being, like this kind of, where he has these long branch-like hands and feet, and his head's like tree branches and twigs, like he's a tree monster. It's an amazing piece of art. It's really, really good. So I have to give credit where credit's due. And that's why he's at number 8. He just looks menacing. He looks terrifying. It fits the whole Fear of the Dark ideology. The stuff for that is great. Be Quick or Be Dead, not really that great of a single cover. Some of the other cover, like Wasting Love, I don't even think Eddie's on that one. Forbidden Eternity, Eddie's not on that one either. But the tour stuff with this, now this is where the tour stuff is really cool. Like some of the stuff where they have like Fear of the Dark Live, where like Eddie is like Steve Harris. It's like a Steve Harris version of Eddie, right? That's a really cool piece of art. That's the Raising Hell cover for the Raising Hell DVD too. That concert they did with Simon Drake, the Magician, really cool. The Live at Donington, where he's like a winged beast over the theater, is a really different take on Eddie, where he has wings and he's flying. They've only ever done that one time, and it's super cool. I love that art. Ties into this whole thing I'm talking about with Fear of the Dark and why it's at number 8. A real live one is cool. A real dead one looks cool, and then the combined real live dead one. So they really hit that home with the Fear of the Dark record. It was just better attention to detail about their mascot, about Eddie. That slacked with No Prayer for the Dying. That slacked with a lot of some of these other records too, the earlier stuff, right? Which is understandable. But that's one thing about Fear of the Dark that I can say. When it comes to Eddie, they did an amazing job with it. The music, not so much, right? Half the record is garbage in my opinion. The other half is pretty good. But Eddie, for Fear of the Dark, was triumphant. And that's why he's at the number 8 slot. Number 7 slot for me, the Number of the Beast Eddie. Now, the reason I say that again, the cover is unbelievable. Like, it's amazing. But we're talking about Eddie here, right? And what's Eddie doing? And what's Eddie look like? Is he a mutant? Is he freakish? What is he? No, he's just Eddie in a white t-shirt with jeans on, right? And he has a devil as a puppet, which looks amazing. I mean, the artwork's great. The Run of the Hills cover is unbelievable. It's same kind of Eddie, but he's fighting off these different... he's fighting the devil, and all these, like, creatures are watching him fight the devil. The cover for Number of the Beast is amazing, where he's holding the devil's head. But Eddie as himself, as we know, like I said, it's pretty much a modified and improved version of Killer's Eddie. It's Eddie with a t-shirt. He has flames in his eyes this time around. And he's just a little bit more sinister. He still has that playfulness and that cheeriness to him and like that badassness to him. But he's not quite as awesome as I want him to be. And the reason why he comes in above Fear of the Dark Eddie is just because that artwork, I mean, that Number of the Beast artwork, and this is what does it for me. Like, that slays. You could sit down the Number of the Beast cover and put it beside Fear of the Dark, for instance, right? Because we're talking about number 8 and number 7 here, respectively, in my ranking, right? Number 8 being Fear of the Dark, number 7 being Number of the Beast. Number of the Beast would chop Fear of the Dark Eddie up and eat him alive with just that look, that crispness of it. Just amazing. Just an amazing piece of art. It's phenomenal, and that's why it's number 7. Not too much to say. Like, Eddie looks cool, but he's not quite improved yet. Number 6, coming in at number 6, Peace of Mind Eddie. Now, this is cool, and I'm not saying that Peace of Mind cover art is better than Number of the Beast, but Eddie himself with the lobotomy and being in the chains. And here's where it gets cool, because you have all these other supplements coming in. Flight of Icarus Eddie looks amazing. Trooper Eddie. This is what seals the deal for the Peace of Mind era Eddie, right? Trooper Eddie. Like he just takes it a step above. Like he seals the deal. He is the embodiment of the lobotomized Eddie, with a dagger in one hand, the British flag in the other, his uniform all tattered, the battlefield. That is one of the greatest pieces of Iron Maiden art ever, and it has to be wrapped into this Peace of Mind. So Eddie himself, a notch above Number of the Beast Eddie. However, I think the Number of the Beast cover is better than the Peace of Mind cover. But I'm not ranking the covers here. I'm ranking the Eddies themselves. Peace of Mind Eddie, slightly above Number of the Beast Eddie at number 6. Number 5 Eddie is going to have to be Alien Eddie from The Final Frontier. Melvin Grant did this one too. I mentioned this earlier, and I was talking about like Virtual 11 and X Factor Eddie's. Like it's that classic artwork. It's that classic look. And I remember looking at the album cover when it came out and loving it, because Brave New World, as I mentioned, was just cloud in the sky Eddie. Eddie is a storm. Dance of Death Eddie, Grim Reaper, with that horrible cover with all those digital crappy renditions of characters around him. Wasn't that, I mean, obviously it's the worst Eddie, right? Matter, Life, and Death cover art was amazing, but Eddie was in the background. You didn't really get a chance to see him. Then they came out with Final Frontier Eddie, and it's like, boom, here he is, front and center. Check it out. And that was really cool. I really enjoyed that version of Eddie. Alien Eddie too, like a walk-on Eddie, super cool. Like he looks really kick-ass. Like he really does. And how he just changed and mutated, like the elongated fangs, the color of his skin, the redness of his eyes. It's almost like an alien mixed with a predator, mixed with Iron Maiden, like mixed with Eddie. It's like very, very cool the way it was done. And what Melvin Grant did with that art is amazing. And if you look at his rib cage, how they kept that yellowish color, they kind of kept that same motif from like Somewhere in Time Eddie, but like for the future, and made it more like jagged and like accentuated looking, which I love. So Alien Eddie is amazing. Now, some of the supplemental artwork for that, they only did El Dorado, and it was more comic booky, where Eddie was kind of like this big, almost like he was like a flying saucer sort of with these hands, like he was some kind of like, I don't know, alien being or overlord that destroys planets and takes over the world, right? Really cool in that respect, and I dug that cover. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was neat. And that whole comic book feel it has to it is really awesome, and I dig that. I'm a big fan of comic books. So seeing that was really cool. I love Alien Eddie, and that's why he's at number 5. He has to be there. Like, he's so cool. He harkens back to the 80s. A lot of the 80s stuff. And in some instances, as far as an Eddie's concerned, I think he's better than some of the 80s stuff. Just Eddie as a character himself, right? What he represents for the album, for the artwork, and just as his character, right? He's a badass Eddie. A tough guy, right? So it's cool to see that. Coming in at number 4. Number 4 for me is probably going to be Book of Souls Eddie. And I have to say this because the cover itself, if you look at it, it's just a black background with Mayan Eddie. Now, Mayan Eddie looks cool, but like there's something lacking. But then when you open up the Book of Souls record or CD or special edition CD or whatever you got of it, and you page through it and you see that full artwork with like him as a Mayan god behind the totems with the band's faces in it and all that stuff, and him with the bloody obsidian dagger with a heart in his hand, and like the tribal chieftain behind him. Eddie as a shaman with the axe. Eddie with the head that he cut off of somebody, the great unknown. That artwork is unbelievable. I mean, I said this in some of the previous podcasts I've done, but it's some of the best artwork Iron Maiden have ever done in their entire career. Like, or got people to do in their entire career. Mark Wilkinson on the cover art, again, he did a lot of stuff with the band, like Best of the B-Sides. I think he did Wicker Man. He did Donington. He did a lot of stuff with the band, like, and he's their guy right now. Like, Derek Riggs is their guy for the longest time, but it's now Wilkinson for the past couple records, right? Man, Mayan Eddie, Shaman Eddie, Book of Souls Eddie, whatever you want to call him, definitely up there. He has to be. So, like, he just looks kick ass. Like, the white tribal or war paint on his face and on his body, and, like, the totem necklace or the shaman necklace he has on, the loincloth that's, like, orangish reddish with, like, tribal Eddie head kind of, like, painted on it. He has, like, scratches on his body and blood's coming out of it. I mean, it's just kick ass. Like, the stone axe, the obsidian daggers. An amazing version of the character. Like, one of the best. When I saw this show live, like, it was a highlight. Like, the whole set is themed around Mayan civilization, and they nailed it with this version of Eddie. One of the best. Definitely coming in for me at number 4. Number 3. Coming in at number 3. Again, Mark Wilkinson. Senjutsu Eddie. Samurai Eddie. A beautiful rendition yet again. If Mayan Eddie was like this top shelf Eddie that harkened back to the 80s in every single way, same thing with Senjutsu Eddie. Like, pretty much everything I just said about Mayan Eddie or Shaman Eddie from Book of Souls, same thing about Senjutsu Eddie or Samurai Eddie from the Senjutsu album. The look is unbelievable. Like, his eyes aren't exactly like blood red. They're like almost like a glazed over whitish red. They look really cool. He has red face paint and war paint on, elongated fangs. He's carrying a samurai sword. He's in this tattered armor. There's like his chest plate and his armor has the symbol on the front of it. That means warrior, I think, in Japanese. It's just unbelievable. Unbelievable to look at. And then again, you open up the sleeve and you get him in the battlefield. There's like a spread. The whole gatefold opens up and it's Eddie in the samurai armor with a dagger in his hand that's bleeding and like tattered battle flags around and all these dead samurais laying in this field, and there's Japanese shrines and daimos behind them and Japanese temples behind them. It's just a beautiful piece of art. It harkens back almost to like the Trooper. It has like a Trooper feel to it, but it's ancient Japan, right? Feudal Japan. It's just a beautiful piece of art. Eddie shooting the bow and arrows, Eddie with the sword, Eddie with the dagger, Eddie with his helmet off on the back of the CD or the record, where he's taking his like Japanese helmet off and you can see his head and everything. The Stratego art with that calligraphy writing. It's just unbelievable. Writing on the wall, again, isn't quite as good because it doesn't really fit the whole samurai motif. It's kind of just like this cloaked rider on a motorcycle. It's cool. But the rest of the artwork for this makes up for it. Totally makes up for it. And I forgot to mention, like, Empire of the Clouds, Mayan Eddie. Like, Empire of the Clouds single cover is amazing for Eddie. It looks amazing. Speed of Light, not so much. But we're on Senjutsu now, right? I forgot to mention that. But Mayan Eddie and Samurai Eddie, some of the best Eddies of all time. And that's why they're number 4, number 3. Senjutsu Eddie is amazing. It has to be up there. Has to be number 3 for me. By far. Number 2 for me. This number 2 and these number 1 are kind of interchangeable, and you probably already know what they are at this point, right? Number 2 for me is Pharaoh Eddie, Mummy Eddie, Powerslave Eddie. This version of Eddie for the longest time was probably my favorite for a while. And then when we get to the number 1, which you probably know what it is already, but these kind of fluctuate back and forth for me. But right now, Powerslave Eddie, Pharaoh Eddie, Mummy Eddie is going to sit at the number 2 slot. The artwork for Powerslave, where he's an ancient pharaoh with the Anubis statues beside him. Then he's a mummy and he's shackled up like for the World Slavery Tour. Then there's some artwork of him busting out of like this pyramid with hieroglyphics on it as a mummy. There's the 2 Minutes to Midnight supplemental work where he's like around the United Nations with a mummy and he has like a gun and he's looking up, but he's a mummy. He's Mummy Eddie. Ace is High Eddie, where he's in the cockpit and he's flying a plane. Just some of these artworks are amazing for this version of the character. This whole mummification of the character is just so deeply interesting and unbelievable. and it's one of the greatest versions of Eddie. And getting to see it, like I said, on the Somewhere Back in Time tour, which is pretty much a modern day world slavery tour, a modern day Live After Death show, unbelievable. And like I just said, Live After Death Eddie coming up out of the grave ties into this too. That artwork in itself is amazing. See, this is where you kind of get like these 3 or 4 really high quality different versions of the character, almost like you would get on Senjutsu or Book of Souls. And this is kind of like the beginning of that, the apex, the height of that, which is phenomenal, and I love it. I love Mummy, Pharaoh, Powerslave Eddie. Like, it's cream of the crop. It doesn't get really any better than that besides my favorite. Like I said, these are interchangeable, but number 1 for me, Cyborg Eddie, Somewhere in Time Eddie, whatever you want to call him, Robot Eddie, Android Eddie, whatever you want to call him. I call him Cyborg Eddie. Just the greatest version of the character, in my opinion, with the laser gun and his body's all mechanical. And as a huge science fiction fan, and androids and robots are like my favorite kind of sci-fi books to read. My favorite sci-fi movies involve androids and robots. I love that motif. I love Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It's one of my favorite sci-fi novels of all time. About replicants. Blade Runner, the movie's based on it. Blade Runner 2049. Terminator, the franchise. iRobot by Asimov. Like, things like that are what I love. I grew up watching RoboCop. I grew up watching Star Wars and the droids like C-3PO, R2-D2. I love Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. Characters like that. Like, and even some modern day movies like Ex Machina, Surrogates with Bruce Willis. All these kind of amazing films like that. That's what I grew up with. That's what I love. And it'll always be my favorite kind of sci-fi. And it's probably always going to be my favorite version of Eddie. As a person who loves history, fantasy, and science fiction, that's why Powerslave Eddie's kind of right there too, because I'm a huge antiquarian. Like, I love ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. And I also love like fantasy stuff too. And that's on Powerslave. You know, you get Flash of the Blade, Young Boy Chasing Dragons, talking about George and the Dragon, like slaying the dragon, all that kind of stuff. And then you get Cyborg Eddie, which is just the most, it's like the master class. It is the best Iron Maiden artwork sleeve ever, in my opinion. It'll never be topped unless they do something like it again, right? The sleeve is unbelievable. Amazing. The Wasted Years cover is interesting. It's kind of cool because you can see his reflection in the console of the spaceship, the time machine, but you don't really see his face, like his whole body. The Wasted Years alternate art where it's like him as like a nebula in outer space is really cool. The Stranger in a Strangeland single cover is mind-blowing. It's like he's in a space cantina, like somewhere from Star Wars, right? Or somewhere from like Star Trek, or the Mass Effect video game where you're in like a cantina. Like, it reminds me of that. Like, he's a bounty hunter. Has this feel to it. Very, very cool feel, and I love it. I love it. I love Cyborg Eddie. I mean, he's the greatest. Like, everything about Cyborg Eddie to me is unbelievable. And Matt and I talked about this on the Somewhere in Time podcast when we talked about that record. Like, that version of Eddie is almost like, and Matt said this, and to quote him, he's like, this is where they start to have like a legendarium of Eddie, where like every piece of art, like single covers, tour posters, album covers, merchandise, everything is about that Eddie and revolves just around that version of the character to make the album more appealing and more centric or centrally focused on that Eddie. And that's why he's number 1 to me. As much as I love Powerslave Eddie, there's still those kind of different hiccups, not hiccups so to speak, but different change-ups, right? Where you have like, first he's a statue and he's a pharaoh, then he's a mummy, then he's 2 Minutes to Midnight Eddie where he has a gun, then he's Aces High Eddie where he's a pilot. Same thing with like some of the other stuff I talked about, like Peace of Mind. It's him on the front in an insane asylum in a straitjacket and chains, but then he's a trooper in the Crimean War. Then he has long hair and he has flamethrowers in his hands and like a wing glider and he's shooting down Icarus out of the sky, right? it's not the same kind of motif all the way through. It doesn't follow that trajectory. Now, with Somewhere in Time, it does. With Somewhere in Time, it follows that trajectory to a T. The versions of Eddie in the single covers are the same. Like, there's not a version where he has long hair, or he has short hair, or he's not a cyborg. He's a cyborg throughout the entire thing. All the singles, all the tour posters, the album art, everything. He's Cyborg Eddie. And it's the most central focus one. And that's why he's number one. And I think that's the greatest version of Eddie that there is. It's just that simple. And again, I've been saying this the past couple of podcasts I've recorded, but I cannot wait to go and see all these different versions of Cyborg Eddie and Samurai Eddie on this Future Past tour. One of the most ambitious things they've ever done. One of the coolest sets I think I've ever seen them do. And I said this many times before, but it's going to be an amazing show. I'm jealous of all my fellow Maidenites out there, and Maiden fans and Maiden family who have got a chance to see it already, because I live in the States. But all you Europeans, I love you. God bless you. I'm so happy and fortunate you guys got a chance to see it, because I know if you're like me, you've been waiting for them to play a lot of these songs, i.e. Alexander the Great, Caught Somewhere in Time, and Stranger in a Strange Land forever. And then to hear the new stuff from Senjutsu, man, I cannot wait to see this in 2024 when they come over here, hopefully. And I'm super excited. But yeah, that's my list of the best Eddies, from the weakest to the strongest, in my opinion. And thanks again, everybody, for supporting the podcast. Thanks for listening. Up the irons. I will see you next time with something new. This has been Joe Labriola from A Matter of Life and Maiden, the podcast of the Beast. Take care of yourselves, everyone. Until next time. And don't waste your time always searching for those wasted years.